I have the pleasure of moderating the last panel of the day, which is the culmination of what we've been talking about this morning. And I have some great folks on the panel, but also look forward to some time for questions. So again, get those index cards up. So we've heard a lot this morning about why this population, why a focus on young adults in particular, and then a great deal from a number of respected stakeholders about what all these initiatives are, some more recent, some forthcoming, some that have been going on for quite some time. The question that we turn to now is, what more can we be doing? Where do we want to take this work on behalf of improving outcomes for young court-involved youth? How do we take that even further? And so the question for tonight's or this afternoon's panel is, what is possible? What can we really see? And I'm going to open up with that very, very broad question of, what are some of the biggest ideas that you have? Where would you like to see the field go forward in improving young adult justice? What's the end goal here? What do we want to see in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now? What is victory, or what is a really effective system for young adults who are court involved look like? And I will start with Vinnie Schiraldi, who is Senior Advisor of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for all coming today. Thank you, Dana. I want to start by doing this. I'm taking my government ID off right now because none of what I'm about to say was vetted with anybody in the government, and it's not the mayor's position, it's not the mayor's Office of Criminal Justice position. This stuff's my stuff. And I was having a great conversation, many great conversations, but one with Judge Kay during the break, and she's like, Vinnie, it's like they're taking down the flag in South Carolina, they're, you know, gay rights has become the law of the land. We need to talk about transformative stuff, not just about a pilot program here and a couple of misdemeanors there. And so I'm gonna take the judge's good advice, as I always try to, and harken back to the founding of the juvenile court, right? 1899, the women of Hull House, Settlement House, Jane Addams, Lucy Flower, Julie Lathrop, right? They're inventing a system that didn't exist before. The day before they invented it, everybody went to the same court. The day after they invented it, nobody goes to the same court again. They kind of arbitrarily, as Jeff Butts will tell you, picked 18. They didn't have science. They went with the mores of the time. That's about when you were an adult then. We now have science. If Jane Addams were alive today and she were inventing a court today, there's no way she would pick 18. There's just absolutely no way she would pick 18. She'd probably do something closer to what they did in the Netherlands, which is pick 23 in April. In April, they raised the age of family court in the Netherlands to 23. In Germany, everybody under 21 starts in family court. In Switzerland, everybody under 25 can be tried as a juvenile. In all of Europe, young people are not housed, young adults are not housed in the same facilities as adults are, as older adults are. Separate facilities, very often different laws. They can get out more quickly. They don't have the same collateral consequences. These are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. Addams, Flower, and Lathrop didn't just invent a juvenile court. They invented adolescence. They actually, literally, the word adolescence doesn't show up in a dictionary until 1904. And so it wasn't just about what are we going to do with this little family court here, which, you know, a handful of kids go through, relatively speaking. They invented child labor laws. Before that, you know, 12-year-olds could go to work in factories. They invented compulsory education, so kids had to go to school, parks and open spaces. They kind of legally created a construct. We haven't done that. We've got a lot of good frenetic activity from the last panel that you heard, right? And the market, if you view the judges, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the police, probation, Department of Correction, as the marketplace, right? The market is speaking. We need special stuff for young people, and to their credit, they're going out and creating those special things within what is their administrative power to do so. They're creating a desk appearance ticket court, right, as part of a continuum of ways to knock kids out. So you got reset, you got a desk DATY, and then you got the adolescent diversion part. So sort of nice little court, prosecutor, police, defense attorney created system. But now we need to systematize this. We need to dream about what we could be 5 or 10 years from now. Jane Addams didn't create a desk appearance ticket court. She created a juvenile court. So we need to start thinking of, do we want to raise the age to 21 or 25? Forget 18 for a second, right? Do we want to raise it to a more developmentally appropriate place? If you talk to neurobiologists and developmental psychologists about this, they will tell you that a 21-year-old, a 25-year-old, these folks are far more like adolescents, 16 and 17-year-olds, than they are like fully mature adults. So if we're really gonna talk about where science can take us, you wouldn't be talking just about a bunch of pilots, as good and noble as those are. You'd be talking about true transformation, which could include raising the age to 21, 23, 25. Good argument to be had. You could be talking about a third system. What do we do with people between 18 and 24, 16 and 24, that's maybe a little more adult-like than what we do with pure juveniles, but not quite as throw them to the winds as pure adults. Or we could be talking about a package of responses that would, yes, separate them from adults when they are incarcerated, like Commissioner Pont and Deputy Commissioner Wynette Saunders has talked about, that could allow for people not to have their lives stained for the stupidest, meanest thing they did during their college years. Who wants to be forever known for the stupidest, meanest thing you did during your college years, right? So that their lives aren't stained by that for the rest of their lives, either by having a youthful offender provision available to them immediately or by some way to seal after a period of good behavior in the community. We could be talking about very aggressive efforts to divert people from incarceration. I like financial incentives. Lots of states have used that, particularly on the juvenile side. New York is not a big one on that, although Gladys Carrion and Liz Glazer did that when they were at the state level, to sort of subsidize alternatives and charge more for incarceration. Those are the kinds of things that we could be dreaming of. I'd prefer to dream bigger and either talk about a full raise the age or a separate system, but reasonable people could disagree, and I suspect reasonable people will. Continue.
So, Chet Hewitt is president and CEO of the Sierra Health Foundation Center for Health Program Management. A very reasonable person, I would say. Do you agree, disagree? What do you think? What's the vision?
Well, I think Vinny is, his recounting of the historical roots of the system for young adults and juveniles kind of speaks to, I think, a widely held a belief that we need to get back to, which is about, the development of young people and the potential they actually have to benefit from rehabilitation. One of the comments that struck me earlier on that Glenn talked about was, what do you really want for kids who find themselves off track? And I think a great place to start would be to ask yourself, what would you want for your own child if they were to find themselves off track as well? There is an elegant simplicity that I think we lack when we really try to think about the complexity about what really needs to change. Because in many respects, it's not all that difficult. We need to not over-incarcerate kids. Kids who find themselves with low-level, non-serious offenses do not need to be in environments that lend themselves to perpetrating or perpetuating behaviors that we know are not good for children. And while many of us have believed this for a long time, the brain science development over the past several years, which was spoken about on the first panel, has solidified that in a way that makes it indisputable. I have a good friend, Elizabeth Kaufman. She's a neuropsychologist. She's done a lot of research on brain development. She was one of the researchers who helped the Supreme Court's Roper case. And one of the things that she says that I find most powerful is that the brain of a 25-year-old is more like that of a 15-year-old than a 35-year-old. And you heard the doctor on the first panel talk about brain development, where we are, self-regulation, the ability to think about future consequences, the ability to push and fend off peer pressure. I see a lot of heads nodding in this audience because you all have your own stories about what it means to be in that particular space. So I think it's critically important that we get back to the roots of what we're talking about, which is, in my experience, an answer to an age-old question, which comes out of my experience running a human service system in Oakland, California, which is, are the systems residual? And that is, are we simply systems that think about our engagement with families and communities when things get so bad that we have the probable cause to intervene in the lives of that family, to remove a child, to arrest a child? Or are we doing what I think we need to do, which is to move back into a space that I think emanates out of this history, which is becoming developmentalist, where our charge is to really work on the healthy development of young people, not to be, in many respects, satisfied by our ability to extract every measure of punitive or punishment because of an act that's not uncommon to the stage of development, adolescence, that many of the young people find themselves in.
Right. Thank you. And the third panelist, Reverend Ruben Austria, the Executive Director, Community Connections for Youth. Can you share with us what is your big picture vision for the field of young adult justice?
It's at the risk of alienating the entire room. I would say the vision for the future that I see for young adult justice is the absence of or a great diminishment of a justice system. Going back to the work of Edwin Scher in 1973, who wrote a book called Radical Non-Intervention, and he said some of the most effective policies for dealing with juvenile delinquency have nothing to do with delinquency. And I think to take a historical perspective, again, a lot of what's happening with young people and the reason why they find themselves kind of perpetually involved in justice systems is really about a lack of opportunity on the other side. So it's a lack of opportunity to be connected to pro-social peers, a lack of opportunity to be connected to pro-social adults, lack of opportunity to be educationally stimulated in ways that would cause them to seek greater things, and lack of employment opportunities. And I really believe that if you were to build those things around young people, probably anywhere from 80 to 90 to 95% of the young adults that we currently see in the justice system would not need to be there or would not even need to touch it. And so I think there's, looking historically again at what we've done with justice policy in this country, kind of going back to the 80s and 90s, when we decided that we believed that young people were super predators and that their families and their communities were inherently deviant, delinquent, and criminal. Those were the words of John DiIulio. That we started to shift the majority of our financial resources into the most punitive and most restrictive and most coercive elements of justice, right? So less after-school programs, more police in schools. Less mentoring programs, more secure facilities. Less counselors, more cops. And that investment in this very coercive system is one that at the same time has bled resources away from the very things that young people need the most to thrive. And so when we think about young people's environments, where they come from, their communities, their families, we see the investment in mass incarceration very much as a disinvestment in communities. Young people, when they get arrested, the communities are losing the people. Not only they're losing the people, they're losing the resources, the money that could be going to their development. We know the numbers right now for one young person in Rikers for a year, $160,000, about the same cost of a adolescent program for 20 kids, 40 kids a year. Kids in the state system or the city system, the costs for juvenile detention now hovering around $300,000 per young person. So a whole lot of money that is leaving communities to go into a justice system apparatus. And then finally, communities lose, I think, the experience of supervising, supporting, and holding young people accountable in the ways that used to happen before I was born, where it wasn't just the job of parents, but it was neighbors, it was aunts and uncles, it was mentors, people around the neighborhood who said, we are going to intervene when we see young people acting up in ways that they shouldn't. And in the past 30 or 40 years, all of that, all of the responsibility and the resources, I think, have dramatically been outsourced to a justice system, right? To the point now where parents, when they have trouble getting their kids to school, will pick up the phone and call the police, right? Or neighbors will see a group of young people on the corner and they'll do the same thing. And there's this idea often in the communities that we can't handle our own young people. And that idea is kind of echoed a lot in the justice reform, that there's certain young people that are just, they're too bad or too dangerous or too difficult to be handled in the neighborhood. And I think the future is really in reversing the investment in justice systems as the primary mechanism to address these issues. And the solution is to invest money in communities to do the things that communities were always meant to do. And I just want to, I can give some examples later, maybe after the next conversation, but I think my concern, right, I know that we need to get young adults out of this current justice system. As we think about a new justice system paradigm for young adults, what I want to think carefully and critically about is that before we start thinking about, well, how do we build the court infrastructure for that? And how do we build additional probation departments for that? And how do we train new judges? And how do we train new DAs? And I'm probably alienating the whole room, right? But that instead of spending 99% of the resources like we currently do on a justice system apparatus to hold young people accountable when they're already in the system, is that we're putting about 90 to 95% of those resources into the community infrastructure that can hold young people accountable. And if you give me the opportunity, I'll talk a little bit about some of the actual types of programs that are already doing this.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in, Dana? I want to say that, Reverend, I don't think you're alienating anybody in the room, and at least I'll just say no one on this particular panel, because I think that you're correct. When we talk about developmental systems, we are talking about education. We are talking about the opportunity to engage in labor market experiences. We are talking about investing in things that actually promote the pro-social development of young people. And we are saying, I think, collectively on this panel, that the idea of investing in those particular activities and doing it in the communities from which the vast majority of these young people come from is the future, of the system. So, just to be clear, I think that is exactly what needs to happen.
So I appreciate the boldness of the ideas offered. And I think it's, as we reflect on some of the things we heard from the earlier panel, and I'm sure everyone from their own experience knows what some of the challenges might be in getting us there. So when we heard about the challenges that ACS has had in trying to site the close-to-home facilities, when we hear about the fear that people are expressing in community meetings about these young people, these young adults are the ones that are committing crimes and that people are most afraid of, perhaps. What's the blueprint? How do you overcome some of the great obstacles that one faces in trying to move to such a different type of paradigm as the one that you've outlined?
One thought I have is that, because I also agree with what Ruben was saying, and I think that this conversation for me is inherently community-based. I think that we know what we heard earlier is that young people are disproportionately influenced by peers, and particularly antisocial peers, to be more risk-taking. Dr. Kaufman, who you mentioned, last time I saw her give a presentation, this great presentation about young people and older adults stopping at red lights. Has anybody ever seen this one, right? So, like, basically, you bring a 19-year-old in and have them play a video game, and if you make it through quickly enough, you get a certain amount of money, but every time you run a red light, you get you lose points, blah, 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 and then you have a 30-year-old do it. And they pretty much run through it when they're by themselves, right around the same amount. They do equivalently good. Then you bring the young person with a couple of his friends and the 30-year-old with a couple of his friends, and the 30-year-old pretty much does the same thing he did when he was by himself, and the young person never stops at a yellow light once, right? They just burn that yellow light every time. So let's take people at that age and put them in correctional facilities. We're surrounded by a bunch of other young people who burn red lights and see what happens. And I think that's what we have, really, that is what we have. We have young people coming out of our correctional facilities reoffending at about 3 times the rate of people over the age of 25. And despite the efforts that we heard about here today, by and large, their experience is go to jail, come out, you're on your own. And so I agree with what Ruben said, and the reason I wanted to say that, and I think the family court is the money flowing through the juvenile court and the juvenile system flows much more heavily to nonprofit organizations than it does on the adult side. Does that mean it's all the way there? I would say no, but there's a much more robust notion that the community is a full-on partner with the family court than is true with the adult court. And to get to your question, that makes it easier. It makes it easier in a couple of ways. One way is then you got a whole bunch of people, because they're decent people, but also because they got some financial skin in the game, fighting to help you get programs established, et cetera, one. And two, you're not establishing a building, because we don't put very many kids in buildings in the juvenile court. We mostly put them into nonprofit organizations that are doing community-based work, like Ruben's group and some other groups that are here today that are doing in-home family services, not necessarily in a building run by either the government or nonprofit. So that makes it a lot easier if you're conceptualizing this as a very community-based group, because then you're not citing big buildings full of scary kids. You're establishing a storefront, or not even doing that, because people are going to the homes of young people. That's where it's really going to happen. It's not really going to happen in buildings full of kids we congregate, because once we congregate them, the job every single day is to fight against the negative peer associations that are occurring in those buildings to try to get a positive thing to happen. That's why very often we're putting them in their own space. And when we can wrestle the money away from correctional facilities to truly follow the kids into the community, I mean, on the juvenile side, it's $260,000 per kid per year. We can keep a kid out. We've saved some robust money that can be used to create the kind of programs we really need for these kids. And oh, by the way, we really do need them for the kids, because they're not just misunderstood. They're committing real legitimate crimes out there, disproportionately violent crimes, certainly disproportionate to the crimes committed by older adults.
Ruben, can you speak to how you would suggest we walk out of this room and deal with the challenges of implementing the vision you outlined?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to change the lens. And I love Jeff Butt's work on this, where he talks about, do we look at young people as villains, as victims, or as resources? And we've been in a predominantly punitive paradigm where young people are dangerous, they're bad, they're criminal, and we have to control them. And I think even in the family court side, we've shifted more paternalistic, where families are broken, they're dysfunctional, they're trauma-informed, or they're traumatized, but we have to help them. And what we're missing a lot of time is the lens of looking at young people as resources, looking at their families as resources, looking at their communities as resources. And I think the place where you begin is you start by saying, from a strengths-based lens, let's look at what's already happening, what's already right with young people, what's already right with their communities, and what's right with their families. And I want to just kind of give like 3 brief examples of how this works out programmatically. We started something in the South Bronx about 5 years ago where we said, well, what if we could just take 10 square blocks in the South Bronx, which we picked very scientifically based on that it was where I lived, and said, could we get 5, 6, 7 different grassroots faith and neighborhood organizations that do good work with young people, get them into a collaborative where we would get young people diverted from the courts and get them plugged into neighborhood supports. And we're able to cut a deal with the prosecutors and to divert cases that they normally don't divert, a lot of the assaults, a lot of the stuff that was normally too serious. Vinny at probation kind of messed up the prosecutor's arrangement, because probation can adjust earlier on, so they sent the lion's share to them. But with all due respect to the family court judges, we wanted to keep them out of the front door of the courts, because we knew that once they were before the court, most likely they would continue to get dragged on, not as a result of committing serious and more dangerous crimes, but as a result of violations. The program was very successful. We had a statistically significant reduction in recidivism. Our kids were about 1/3 less likely to get rearrested. That didn't really surprise us. I think the more important finding was that the average kid stayed 3 to 4 times longer with the program than they were mandated by the court to do. A lot of the kids stayed with us 2 or 3 years. And when I say stayed with us, that doesn't mean that they were in programming 5 days a week, but it meant that they were connected to a neighborhood-based network of adults, community organizations doing things that had nothing to do with juvenile justice. A bunch of the kids just did their second harvest of hot peppers in a community garden that they're selling to make hot sauce in the Bronx. And so, right, it's these weird programs that they're not evidence-based in the traditional stretch, right? But it was getting kids plugged into neighborhood supports that already existed on a level. Second thing, getting family members connected to one another. And a bunch of our family members had been part of a research project where they kind of outlined family experiences with the juvenile justice system and really busted apart the myth that families don't care. Said, no, family members do care, they're just often not engaged. It led to some really great conversations, again, with probation and Vinny, where our family members actually put forth a model where they said the number one thing we want, they said we don't want parenting classes from probation officers, we don't want functional family therapy, we don't want any of these things that basically kind of make us feel bad about who we are as parents. We want support from other family members who have been through this and can help us navigate this system and also help us deal with our kids when we're getting ready to tell the probation officer, just violate him and take him out of my house. And I think to their credit, probation went and put together a initiative that outsourced a contract for parent peer supports to 5 different community-based organizations around the city. And so we have a team of parent peer coaches that staff the court. They work with families, they help them navigate. But more than that, what's happening is that family members are starting to use a network of family support and community support rather than relying on the justice system, right? So people, again, who used to call the police when there was like an incident in the house, instead are calling another family member or calling a mentor. And the third thing is, again, great partnership with probation during Vinny's tenure, put together an initiative called Arches. And Arches was a credible messenger mentoring program that basically said, we're going to take every 16 to 24-year-old on probation, that kind of highest risk group, and the ones who are actually sort of the least program ready, and we're going to contract this out to 19 community-based organizations. Very ironic that the cost to run one of these programs for 40 kids a year is $160,000, which is about the same cost of locking up one adolescent on Rikers, right? But that they would send kids to these programs, but the major thing about this was that the programs were staffed, it required them to hire men and women who they defined as credible messengers. People who were from the same neighborhoods, who had been formerly justice involved, people who could really get into the hearts and minds of these young people and say, this is how you take steps out of a gang. This is how you resist the peer pressure. This is how you join to a new supportive community that meets your need for belonging, it meets your needs for significance, it meets your needs to be in a place that's real and not corny, but is going to do good things. And that initiative, which has employed over 100 mentors around the city, has been replicated in NYCHA for the youth who are most at risk of violence. And I think the most exciting thing that's come out of it, again with support from the Pinkerton Foundation, we've invested in training the graduates of these programs as peer mentors for the next generation. And I'll tell you that when we send these 18 to 24-year-olds into facilities or to talk to schools, you can hear a pin drop. Because kids who are in there and are thinking those very questions, how in the world am I supposed to break my negative peer associations? You know, my whole project is blood, or my whole, block is Crip. What am I supposed to do when I get out? And they have young people who literally 2 or 3 years ago have walked through that same strategy. And so when you take Glenn Martin said it, the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. When you take the people who are the most impacted, and you actually invest in them to be the change resource, then that's where it happens. And I think, again, it is a question of will and where do we put our money, right? Because we're worried about a spike in violent crime this summer. So we can allocate as a city $170 million to hire 1,000 new police officers. I would bet my program, I would bet the very little money that I have, that if instead of hiring 1,000 new police officers, we hired 1,000 more young adult credible messengers, even young adults who are sort of, if I don't get something positive to do and I don't get employment, I might find myself drifting back to the streets. If we employed them to be peer outreach workers and to be violence interrupters and to pull kids into the program, I would bet that would have a much more significant impact in the drop of violent crime than hiring 1,000 new police officers. But those aren't decisions as a society that we're ready to make yet, right? We still want to say, how do we, first let's make sure we're investing in the more kind of hardcore safety stuff and then see what's left over for kind of community interventions. We have to flip that paradigm on its head.
So thank you. Chet, you have had a great deal of experience working directly with young people. So your work as an attorney representing court-involved youth, your work as running the social services division of Alameda County, and some of your own personal experiences as a young person in New York City. What does this different type of a justice system look like for those young people? Can you just explain why this is so important for that individual life?
Well, I think that, many of the panelists up here and others have alluded to it, and I think Ruben has spoken to it, pretty directly. It is a transformation of what we typically have. This is not kind of changes on the margins. This is a fundamental rethinking of how we operate the system, what we find valuable within it, the roles that professionals actually play within that particular system, because while community groups have a critical role to play, and young people have a critical role to play, the professionals who administer those systems also have important roles to play in a system that has got to be very, very different. When we were thinking about this particular panel, and I was asked to think about this question about what is possible, the thing that struck me first was, what do we have the political and public will to actually do, as a better question. I mean, for me, that kind of frames this notion of possibility. Because, Gladys talked about trying to cite some of the community facilities and getting pushback. My sense was that you didn't hear from the entire community. You didn't hear, it's in many respects, those who show up first and speak loudest are the folks who we respond to. And sometimes we have to be brave enough, because a big piece of this is about courage, personal courage as leaders, and the willingness to actually look in communities much more deeply and find those who understand and have a relationship with the type of change you're trying to do, and having them become, giving them the ability to kind of express their idea of what the preferred future looks like for their particular children as well. And, the science, the kind of policy frameworks, the evidence is actually there for, making these changes. What we often don't have is the ability, as my mother would say, to have the stick-to-itiveness that we need in order to see our way through the challenging community meetings and other things that we have got to do in order to save our children. And to work with them in ways that isn't just about what we do for them, but engaging them in that process in new and creative and inclusive ways. I woke up yesterday morning thinking about this particular question, and the first thing I saw on my phone, which flashes me all types of news reports, was new photos from Pluto from the New Horizons spacecraft, 3 billion miles away. I said to myself, what is impossible? What does that actually look like today? If you think about, the human capacity to do something extraordinary as that, then it's, for me at least, almost unimaginable to think that we cannot solve the problems that we actually have relative to this particular system. I want to say a couple of things that I think that we have to do, which I think really need to be put on the table. We have to really deal with the perspective that many of our kids of color have relative to the criminal justice system or in the juvenile justice system. Because for many of them, and I'm one of those kids, I, like Glenn, spent some of my formative years on Rikers Island. I got my GED from Rikers Island before going on and doing other things in my particular life, because folks in my community embraced me and gave me opportunities at a point in my life when perhaps I was not the most deserving youth. So this notion of who deserves what intervention is something that we have to rethink. Because oftentimes we give it to the child who is performing best, or who seems from a merit base to have or be positioned to be the most deserving. And sometimes it's the child who's struggling, who's calling out for help, is actually the most needy. And our ability to get back this notion of punishment, right? To really think about the development of a young person, I think is a critical part of this particular question. This other question about the basic sense of unfairness in the system. Basic unfairness. And you can't have this conference and not talk about the unrest that we've seen around this country. From some tragic, number of incidents. But what it's really unleashing, aside from, a pushback on those tragic occurrences, is an expression and a deeply felt belief that the system is patently unfair. That it is stacked against, the success, particularly of kids of color in this particular country. And that we as a society would be willing to invest in things that have little developmental supports or effectiveness to them, rather than investing in the young people themselves. Now, it's easy to sit up here and use the language that I'm using, and I can tell you there are some young people who can explain this much more quickly, right, and clearly than I could.
With much more vivid language.
Yeah, but my grandparents are from Barbados. They came to Brooklyn in the early 1900s. we have been taught that modesty was a highly valued commodity. And so my language and decorum will represent that in this stage in my life. But I'll tell you that if we're unable to get people to convince them that we as a society love and care about them, right, to the point that we're willing to invest our time and resources, support their healthy development, this is a non-starter question. Because they, more than us, have got to believe that this is real and true, and that our commitment is not something that we're going to walk away from. So this notion of what political will that we have for this new vision of a system, I think, is essential. Two things quickly that I also want to add. The first is, we have to have this conversation, and it's beginning to happen here, that while most of our systems are organized vertically for accounting purposes and so forth, and how we spend public resources. I'm a county welfare director in California. You understand what that means. But people live horizontal lives. You can talk about education, and you can talk about safety, and you can talk about labor market opportunities, and you can do all those things in workforce investment boards, child welfare, and juvenile justice. But people live this way. People need some of each one of those things to have good, healthy lives. And so this notion of more porous walls between those systems, and I'm talking about moving beyond collaboration. I'm talking about interdisciplinary approaches that are rooted in the belief that you need a series of experiences to actually grow up to be healthy, I think is essential. I actually think should be mandated. And it gets me to my third point. Because in California, where we're really proud of Prop 47, Prop 109, we have a ballot initiative process where we have put these things into statute, right? We have taken former felonies that were non-serious and non-violent, and we have mandated they be actually misdemeanors, right? We have changed three strikes legislation in the state where you only get your third strike if it's a violent offense, with some exceptions, of course. And we have devolved a lot of the criminal justice system from the state level back to county, so people are in their local communities getting services where they belong. But you've got to move beyond the kind of initiative process, the pilot projects. I've been in this business long enough to know that pilot projects, despite great leadership and deep commitment, are the first things to go when times get tough. Right? There is a statutory requirement to put this stuff and fix it in law in ways that mandate that people follow this new paradigm. So raise the age field in New York State. Right? As someone from California, and I tell you, I was born here in New York City, to hear about all the great stuff that's happening and see that kind of public policy disconnect is a really challenging thing to experience. Because they say that public policy at its core is an expression of public values, right? And if you value your children and you believe that rehabilitation is something that they deserve, not something they have to earn, right, then I think you would align your larger policy framework the types of things that are being expressed here, including the inclusion of community as a central part of that transformation.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to the audience in just a minute for some questions, but I did have one last quick question that I wanted to pose, and I was hoping that maybe you all could take just a short time to answer it, which is, when we opened this morning, Carol Mason spoke about a range of initiatives that are happening across the board in the criminal justice system. So addressing the issue of solitary confinement. Within the mayor's office, we've been looking at bail reform writ large. There's a mental health task force that has been advancing a number of initiatives. Why a focus on the young adult population, and is that in fact peeling away attention on one population rather than looking at the system as a whole?
I really don't want to go after Chet Went. I got the applause and everything. So,
You can give him applause.
I think that it's very well established in American jurisprudence that we should have a family court. And it wasn't, right? So after they founded the juvenile court in 1899, the next 25 years, all but 3 states established family courts. So it was a watershed moment. And so now we all believe, of course, we should have a family court. We fight over what age. We fight over which kids should be expelled from it for what reasons. But no one's saying we absolutely shouldn't have a family court at all, or almost no one. And when you read any credible neurobiologist or developmental psychologist, it basically says that the people between the ages of 18 and 25 are more similar to adolescents than they are to fully mature adults. So if you believe that science, unless you have reason to doubt it, which I don't think there is substantial reason, and you believe there should be a family court, how can we allow the young people in this age group to pass through our systems in ways that are just so completely ineffective, so lacking of what Greg Berman talked about earlier, legitimacy? I remember Ralph spoke earlier, and Ralph was in charge of my Brooklyn office when I ran probation. And I remember going to visit Ralph the first time and standing in a waiting area downstairs, because the probation department is in the same building as the court there, and watching this sea of young black and brown men, largely, go through the metal detectors. And it was just like, okay, we're just going to greet you by telling you how much we hate you right from the very beginning of your coming into this building. And then they're going to go up to court, where by and large I later saw, they just kind of sit around, falling asleep all day. Finally, somebody calls their name, and they wake up. They go up to the defendant's table. The defense attorney says something incomprehensible to them. The prosecutor yells at them. The judge lectures them, and they pretty much go home after that. If it was my kid, I have a 22-year-old, right? He's back home again. That happens to a lot of us, right? And I was trying to design a system to make him alienated from my society and my courts and my prosecutors and my police. I could hardly do better than what we're doing by accident. A few worthy efforts to the contrary notwithstanding. We got to fix that. If we don't fix that, by the way, young adults, 16 to 25, make up 49% of the violent felony arrests in New York. So we're not talking about a trivial matter. This is half our violent crime problem, and we generally process them through the court system in ways that make them less likely to want to be the kinds of people we would like them to be. If we don't fix that, we're just going to continue to sow to reap what we've sowed. And I don't think there's any way around it, because yelling at people, embarrassing them, humiliating them doesn't change their developmental psychology, doesn't change their neurobiology. Their brains are going to function the way their brains function. They're going to run that yellow light every time.
No, there are
You
two.
can clap, by the way, if you want.
I'll clap for you, Jimmy. That was that was spot on. I love Vinny and his willingness to be one of those courageous public officials that I talked about, who's really prepared to push back on some of the forces that we find oftentimes in the communities themselves who are not aboard into this. And I would also just ask us all to understand why some of that is, because that is both around race and class and experience as well, because some of the folks who live in these communities have been victimized by some of the things that we're talking about as well. But to answer your question specifically, I think it's both smart and fair. And those are two concepts within the public health world that I think are really important. We often refer to it as equity, fairness, not equality. And I think that we're moving into a term where equity is the kind of resounding framework for the work that we actually do. And my mother always explained it to me in a very simple way. She always said that my brother got the biggest piece of chicken on the table because he was bigger than I did and needed more caloric intake. And so it wasn't about everybody having the exact same slice of pie or the exact same amount of food on their plate. It was, what did you need? And so could I give you what you actually needed? And I say that because, when you think about fairness in this country, that is the group that has been most harmed by a criminal justice system built on a false set of, research efforts that we talked about that have subsequently been debunked to a very large degree. And so why would you not want to invest in correcting that problem? Fairness as a society suggests that we have got to do that we have over-incarcerated, mass incarcerated, and set up a processing system that actually does harm to young adults. I mean, that's the short story of today. And so when you say, are we somehow peeling it back? No, in many ways, we are making amends. And I would ever argue a little bit late. Because many of us have known about a lot of this data for a considerable amount of time. And so we should do that. The SMART piece is simple, that there has to be a much more effective way to doing what we're doing than the way that we're actually, doing it now. The whole idea that, doing the same thing you're doing, expecting a different result is like the definition of insanity. In some ways, we have got to forgive ourselves for our past discretions, absolution for everyone, and think about a new preferred future that's built on fairness and equity and a real sense of social justice that our young people believe is active and alive and worth buying into. Otherwise, they won't.
I'm going to say that focusing on this population is an absolute mandate. And I'm going to say it from the faith and community perspective. I think from the faith-based perspective, there's a scripture in the Bible that says the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And it's this notion that the very thing that is the most despised and hated and outcast is actually the place where God chooses to say, this is where I want to build my work around. When Jesus came out, people said, could anything good come out of Nazareth? And you just see this paradigm of change and growth happening not from the top down and not from the kind of upper echelons of society, but in the very things that are most kind of hated and despised and rejected. And so I think there's a spiritual mandate to see these young people as the focus of what needs to happen in our society. But the second reason, building on this from a community angle, is that these are the young people really that are they're either going to wreak havoc on the community or they're going to rebuild it. I live in the South Bronx, and I know that this group, right, of 16 to 21, 24-year-olds, these are young people that often are involved, can easily be involved in some pretty horrific stuff. And all you got to do is read any of these federal indictments where sometimes they're watching kids from the ages of 15 to 18 and cataloging all the stuff that they've been involved with, drug crews and gangs and murder hits. And I've known plenty of young people like this who really they've been involved in some pretty terrible stuff. But the thing about them, because of their age, because of their development, because of the way their brains work, they're not involved in it because they have at some point in their life decided they've made this lifelong commitment to be a hardened criminal, or it's just, right, that they're just criminally oriented. They're involved in it because of peer associations. They're involved in it sometimes because it's fun and it's risky and it gives them a buzz. They're involved in it sometimes because of lack of opportunities. But these are the young people that if you either just leave them to their own devices or you just further isolate them from the pro-social aspects of society through these heavy justice system involvements, they're going to get worse and their influence is going to get worse, right? And so they are going to be responsible for the shootings and they are going to be responsible for violent spikes in crime. And yet these are the very same young people that we have a book right now of about 50 young people who are just telling, they're graduates of the Arches program and the leadership program, and they're just telling their life stories, right? And you see how much trauma they've been through, and you see how much sometimes really bad stuff they've been involved with. Whenever people talk about, well, New York City, the spike in crime, it's only a few crews, it's a very small percentage. Some of these young people are that percentage, right? They're that small percentage. And yet these are young people who in a pretty short amount of time, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, have gone through a fundamental transformation in their thinking where it's like they're opening their eyes and they're saying, wow, I've been harming my community. I've been part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. I want to help other kids. I want to tell my peers to stop gangbanging. And these are not like the debate club kids, right, who are saying, oh, look at these young people with great ideas, right? These are the kids who are really in it. And these young people, when they start exercising their leadership, right, these are kids who will tell you, in a crew of 10 people, 9 out of 10 of the people in the crew want to leave the crew. They don't want to be involved in it, but they don't have like the courage to do it. I took a step out and I said, I'm going to do something positive, and other people started following me, right? And so I think if you invest in the leadership of these young people, right, they really can lead us out of this mess. But it comes back to saying that the very thing that we're the most scared of, the very thing that we've had the least hope in, this is where the power lies, and our job is to invest in their leadership because they can and will do it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. I am going to ask 2 questions and hope that the panelists can address one of them or both quickly so we can get it in. And the questions are, how do we as the federal government better use our resources to seed change? If pilot programs are not the paradigm, what is a better framework? And then to the 3 men on the panel, how is gender being considered related to reform for young adults in the criminal justice system? And again, incredibly important questions. So hopefully we can speak with some brevity to get them both.
Can I take a shot at the federal answer? So there's two thoughts I have. One is that I wouldn't go with seeding a whole bunch of pilot programs. What I would suggest seeding is systemic reform in a variety of jurisdictions, either states or counties or cities, like the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, where it's comprehensive reform in a handful of places so that other places can then say, whoa, look what Toledo, Ohio is doing with young adult justice. And it's not just one little program here, it's systemic, it's cross-agency, it's cross-community in ways that are approaching the profound kind of stuff we've been talking about. And then the other thing is, you guys own several justice systems. You own the biggest prison system in the country. Your 18 to 25-year-olds are randomly distributed throughout that prison system. You know, I know it's a big system across 50 states and the District of Columbia, so it's spread out. But my bet is that in LA or Chicago or New York or DC, there's enough young adults for you to be able to create your own model approach right within the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Probation and the court system. You have those elements right within your own control, and you could serve as an example for the rest of the country in ways the federal system used to serve as an example for the rest of the country, but frankly no longer does.
Quickly, I think that one of the things that at the federal level that could be done is, I think a further exploration around the use of financial incentives and actually to change behaviors within those particular systems, as well as the performance measures you're actually using to actually evaluate those systems. And I think a good place to look for examples.
Sneak preview.
I think a good example of that is what has happened around child welfare with the federal reviews and some of your experimentation around 4E waivers where you allowed actually states to actually keep the revenue they would normally have lost when they drive down caseloads. And it's interesting how that has actually changed behaviors in a number of jurisdictions relative to how they interact with children and families as well. It's a reward system. You actually reward folks for doing what's best for kids. On the women's side of the equation around juvenile justice, I will just say we need to do a heck of a lot better. We have a project at Sierra Health called Positive Youth Justice Initiative. It's really built around trauma-informed care, wraparound services. We're thinking about the use of data, particularly as it relates to proportionality. And we have a few counties who are really beginning to deal with this issue around gender. But it's not a lot that I report that's saying there's a lot of great things happening. We need to pay more attention to it.
To the feds, I would say keep on investigating New York City politicians. Oh man, this is being live streamed, right? But no, on a
Just not government officials, no.
yeah, the Bronx. I think one thing I would like to say that the feds could really do. What always breaks my heart is when I read about the announcements of some of these busts that have taken 2 to 3 years of coordination and planning, and they say, this morning pre-dawn raid, 60 people arrested in this housing project. And then they talk about the success of interagency coordination, right? We're collaborating with the DEA and AFT and the NYPD. And there's this great thing about we picked up 60 people. And you look at who gets picked up sometimes and you say, some of these people who've been picked up, who you've been watching for 3 years, some of them you started watching when they were 15, 16. And you're telling me that with all of this interagency coordination and all of this research and all of this collaboration, you couldn't figure out that there were some young people there who didn't need to get busted, maybe the majority of them, and collaborate with partners on the ground to kind of say, who are the kids? And I recognize you got to do your duty in terms of there's some people that are really driving the show and have to be taken off the streets. But there's a whole lot of young people that if you did stuff like they did in Boston with the police and the clergy and kind of started to figure out of every 10 kids, there might be 1 or 2 who are driving the action and 8 or 9 wannabes who are following around, and can we get to that collaborative table, not just law enforcement, but community members, clergy, credible messengers, to say, what are we doing for those kids who are really on the cusp and they're being pulled into this lifestyle, but they could just as easily be kind of pushed in the opposite direction. So that's what I would encourage the feds to do. I think on the gender side, again, it's about investing in leadership and investing in programs that represent that leadership. So, you know, this initiative Arches, right, which is great, 800 young people a year. It was part of the Young Men's Initiative, but I think what we're seeing all the time in juvenile justice, even though it's only about 20% of kids in the system are young women, that the issues tend to be even highly more concentrated among young women. The trauma, the family dynamics, and so I think gender-specific programming is key. And again, especially investing in female mentors, investing in the types of leadership opportunities where there's safe space for young women and girls. And also, I think just getting beyond the paradigm, like, again, Young Men's Initiative is great, but just like on these different tracks, right? And Chet said people aren't vertical, right? Like, the domestic violence is one of the things driving crime in New York. A lot of this stuff is happening in relationships. It's happening in families. And so it's saying that in all of these different identities that people have, we have to look at it as a whole. How are our young people doing as a whole? How are young men and young women relating to each other? How are they getting along and being able to invest in the types of supports that help them to have healthier and more functional relationships, so that those relationships themselves are not things that are driving their involvement in the system?
Thank you. So I hope I speak for the room when I say that this was really a fantastic conversation and way to end the day. There are a lot of familiar faces, colleagues, associates in this room who I know have been working together, crossing paths in many different ways on a number of different issues. But I hope that what we've been able to do in this morning is have some renewed energy and perhaps some renewed inspiration and ambitions for how we can continue the work, and in particular this focus on the young adult population, because the opportunities are great, the potential is significant, and I think, as we've heard, the potential payback could be nothing less than transformative. So hopefully we will be just beginning this conversation in this regard. Thank you so much to John Jay for hosting us, everyone who helped to put this together, and all of the panelists. A round of applause for everyone.